Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning to what I believe will be a very interesting talk, and I'm really looking forward to it myself. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor John Compton, who's speaking to us all the way from Cape Town. John is from the San Francisco Bay Area originally. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of California at San Diego in 1981 and his PhD from Harvard University in 1986. He taught at the School of Marine Science at the University of South Florida before moving in 1996 to the Department of Geological Sciences at the University of Cape Town. At Cape Town, he taught a first-year introductory course on Earth and environmental sciences, and in collaboration with students and colleagues, he has published over 60 papers spanning a wide range of research topics that include the integration of geology and human evolution, so-called geoarchaeology. He is now an emeritus professor and continues to work on various research projects, as well as publishing natural history books, including the book which is the subject of today's talk, namely Human Origins. John, thank you very much for being prepared to talk to us and for the preparation of this talk. We're really looking forward to it.
Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I can't be with you there in Hermanus this morning. I had some other commitments today that made the timing a bit risky, so I decided to Zoom it. Yeah, so as Gert mentioned, I've now lived in South Africa for over 25 years. And I think invariably all of us become interested in human origins living in Africa, because after all, it's in Africa where our Homo lineage evolved. And what I want to try to do this morning is give you at least a brief introduction to some of the ideas around what may have compelled humans to evolve in the first place, and why in particular Southern Africa might be critical to our evolution. When people speak of human evolution, they often think of East African Rift Valley, and justly so. There are many very key archaeological sites in the East African Rift Valley. There's also been a large number of new and interesting deposits found in North Africa, in what's called the Maghreb, in Morocco and those areas. But of course, in our own Southern Africa, South Africa in particular, along the coast, there have been a number of key finds at well-preserved and hence well-dated cave sites, many of which you maybe have heard of, Blombos, Pinnacle Point. You have your own De Kelder's cave there in Hermanus. So the South Coast appears to have been, like today, a very desirable place to live. Lots of water, lots of resources, both terrestrial and marine. So I want to try to give you this morning kind of an idea of how it might have played out, somewhat in a speculative sense, but based on what we understand and things we've dated, what may have been some of the key factors in the evolution, particularly of modern humans in Southern Africa. Africa, of course, is a very large continent, and we know it's the cradle of humankind based on a large amount of evidence. And as I mentioned initially, some of the key areas, particularly rich in archaeological material, have been within the East African Rift Valley. This is the large valley that extends throughout Eastern Africa that was elevated tectonically in the last 7 million years or so, breaking up the rainforest and creating environments that were suitable for humans. And then at the northern and southern tips of Africa are other localities where we have a lot of archaeological evidence that suggests, particularly in the case of our species, Homo sapiens, their evolution, and in particular their cultural evolution. And what I'm going to argue here is that the evolution of humans in Africa was certainly very complex. In part, this was because of the size of the continent and also because of the large variety of environments in which our human ancestors were living. And I'm going to argue that there were two, I think, key drivers in the evolution of our species. The first had to do with geographical isolation, and I'll explain in a minute how this was driven by major climate fluctuations that resulted in the contraction and expansion of environments within Africa, and that this allowed for groups to be periodically isolated from one another and then rejoined. The second aspect that I think was very critical was the discovery of seafood. Quite early on, humans were definitely taking advantage of aquatic resources, those that were near rivers, lakes, and that made sense because, of course, ultimately we very much depended on water. So having a source of fresh water was key, and some of those resources associated with fresh water, catfish, other types of fish, amphibians, insects, bird eggs, so forth, were very important. And I'm going to argue here that it was the initial discovery and consistent adaptation to a seafood diet that was perhaps very important, very critical in allowing humans, modern humans, to develop our unusually large brains and from their cultural evolution. Now in this slide, it's a little bit busy, but the main point I wanted to make here in this slide is that the focus of this talk is really on the most recent million years, or really 500,000 years, that you see in the red circle there at the top. But it is important to state at the outset that, of course, the human lineage was initiated probably between 6 and 7 million years ago. This would have been when humans broke away from the other great apes in Africa by going bipedal. So the initial step, if you like, in our evolution was the adaptation to walking habitually on two legs. This is generally associated with what I mentioned earlier about the East African Rift Valley opening up, the loss of rainforest and the need for primates, baboons being the other, but that humans' lineage broke away by leaving the forest and going into savanna and woodland environments where bipedalism was adapted in those environments. But importantly, for that initial 3 million year period, the cranium, the brain size of humans had not increased very much. So you have in the green box here, you have the Australopithecines, like famous Lucy and the Sediba fossil that's been found in South Africa. In the yellow side over here, you have the Paranthropus, which were quite uniquely, robustly jawed individuals. And both the Australopithecines and the Paranthropus appear to have both gone extinct. And then the lineage that really then took off was that of Homo, and that involved a series of species, including particularly Homo erectus. And in the last million years or so, the evolution of descendants of Homo erectus eventually into other Homo species. And these would have included quite a range of individuals, species. In Eurasia, there is the Neanderthals, there were the Denisovans, there were the so-called Hobbit in Indonesia, and perhaps others. So not that long ago, it wasn't just our species, Homo sapiens, it was quite a suite of Homo species. And of course, today, we're left with just ourselves. All the other species have become extinct. We do carry some of their DNA in our DNA, but a relatively small percentage. How is it that these species turnovers happen? Why did Homo erectus evolve eventually into Homo sapiens? And one of the arguments, or one of the main reasons for that, is believed to be these large, major global climate cycles. And that's what this plot tries to show you. If we look to the far right That's 0, that's present day. And then it stretches back to around a little over 600,000 years. And the main point about this plot is you can see these very large fluctuations, large amplitude fluctuations in sea level, where sea level is ranging between about 130 meters below present day and perhaps as high as 10 or 20 meters above present day. These fluctuations in sea level are understood to be related to the buildup and then melting of large ice sheets, primarily in the northern hemisphere. That's why we refer to them as glacial interglacial cycles, because today we're living in an interglacial where sea level is relatively high. But just 20,000 years ago, you can see sea level was 120, 130 meters lower than today. And that was because there were huge ice sheets in the northern hemisphere, covering large parts of North America and Eurasia. And to give you some sense of just how big those ice sheets were, the 130-meter lowering of sea level everywhere, remember the sea covers 71% of the Earth's surface, went into ice that was then stored on land as these huge ice sheets. The idea is that around 100,000 years ago, 120,000 years ago, sea level was comparable to today. And then it went through a series of lowerings of sea level as the ice sheets in the northern hemisphere gradually built up to some maximum extent. And then, interestingly, they reach a state of inherent instability. And once they start to melt, they melt very quickly. So what we see are these very rapid rises in sea level, like in the last 18 to 10,000 years. And that represents the melting of all that ice. So these huge global climate cycles, you can see they repeat roughly every 100,000 years. They're not always the same amplitude. They're not always the same time, period, spacing between them, but roughly orders of 100 meters of sea level change every 80 to 120,000 years. So this was a repeated, if you like, stress test for life on Earth, including humans. It gives you a sense of how different the Earth's climate can be, even in the relatively recent past, geologically speaking, in which the global mean temperature is estimated to have changed by roughly 5 degrees Celsius. Now, you may be aware, of course, of the current concerns around global warming, and the estimates are that global temperatures have increased by about 1 to maybe 1.2 degrees Celsius. But the projections, if we carry on with business as usual, and CO2 and other greenhouse gases continue to increase, we may well be within the 3 to 5 degree global mean temperature change. Now, we don't, of course, know exactly what this will mean in terms of global climate, but to give you some sense, we can look at what a 5 degree global temperature change did in the past. And that is very dramatic. You had these huge ice sheets covering the UK, Scandinavia, Northern Europe. You had huge ice sheets covering all of Canada, all the way down to the mid-United States. New York City, Boston, and so forth were completely covered. And these ice sheets were like 3 or 4 kilometers thick. So that just gives you, in the sense not of global warming, but global cooling, and the extent to which 5 degrees, which may not sound like a lot to you, for a mean global temperature change is actually huge. And hence the concern about a rise in sea level that is happening now. For our ancestors, for those who were living in Africa or really anywhere in the world, although we didn't have large ice sheets in Africa, these climate cycles still had big impacts. And to depict that impact, let's look at a contrast of the African continent between an interglacial and a glacial. And I should comment that in this, on the image on the left here, interglacial would be typical of actually the maximum warming and wetness. So you can see that the Sahara has turned into a semi-desert grassland with lakes and so forth. Now, of course, that's not the case now, but it was the case that the Sahara had fields of grass and lakes just about 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago. The big contrast, of course, with that and a glacial, now a glacial is that time period when we have a full-on development of ice on Earth covering the northern hemisphere. The Antarctic ice sheet, which of course exists today, has remained more or less what it always has been. It's much older. It dates back to about 30, 40 million years ago. And it's thermally isolated and it's relatively stable. Greenland, of course, is the only bit of ice that is remaining in the northern hemisphere from the last glacial maximum. But it too, of course, is threatened by global warming and is probably one of the most vulnerable to melt within the near future. When there's huge ice sheets in the northern hemisphere, it affects the global climate, and we see a huge contraction of the tropical rainforest. We see an expansion in aridity in the Sahara, in the Namib-Kalahari Desert system. And so the idea is that populations of humans that were living in Africa had to, of course, adjust and adapt to these major climate cycles. And the way they most likely would have done that is move to areas that were habitable. So that might include like the Maghreb to the north, Ethiopian highlands, the East African Rift lake systems, perhaps some of these regions here, Central Africa, and also Southern Africa. And the point being here is that these populations would have been relatively isolated from one another. And by isolation, I mean that they couldn't commingle, they couldn't get together and have sex, basically. And in that case, their genes, their genome, is relatively isolated within these populations. And in that way, the genes can evolve separately from each other, the different groups. Now, in the return to the interglacial, and remember these are these cycles that are going back and forth, so we have repeated cycles roughly every 100,000 years. These areas get wet and allow for the movement of people outside of those refugia and allows them now to commingle. And the thing about species is that your main criteria is that you can have viable children after you have sex so that your reproduction can carry forward. And that certainly would have most likely been the case for these groups that were leaving these isolated areas because they hadn't been isolated for terribly long. And we know that because even though we were isolated from the Neanderthals for roughly 400,000 years, we were still able to have children with them and pass along that Neanderthal DNA. And as I mentioned, each of us has a couple of percent Neanderthal DNA in our genomes. So that's the idea, that it's these very intense climatic fluctuations that are happening on this periodic return cycle that continually stresses population groups within the continent. And of course, globally, there were humans, of course, in Eurasia, in our lineage, Neanderthals, Denisovans, perhaps others, and they also would have been affected, of course, but there were no humans, say, living in North or South America. In Africa, even though it had no major ice sheets, it still had these major climatic impacts. And that's what drove people into periodically isolated populations and then allowed them to rejoin, remix their gene pool, and then get isolated again. That's the idea. And the way that works genetically, and in terms of a new species, so how you get from Homo erectus to Homo heidelbergensis to our predecessor species to Homo sapiens, us, is of course you change the genome, our DNA. And the way you do that is in allopatric speciation, also known as vicariance, is you geographically isolate a group and their DNA evolves independently of the main group. And so the usual idea is that you have a peninsula that becomes an island, and it can only initially have a certain genetic variation on that island. And then over time, especially if those groups of people on the island are subjected to different forces of evolution, they're going to evolve genes differently than the parent groups that they had left. And so in a way, we can just think of these isolated areas in Africa as being islands, if you like, of populations that are not able to physically intermingle with other groups, and therefore their DNA evolves separately. Now, of course, they rejoin periodically, remix the gene pool, and then re-separate it. So that's why it's so complicated, right? That's why the evolution in Africa was so complex. Now, why would Southern Africa have been so important? Well, this gives you an idea. This is a topographic map in the warm colors and then a bathymetric map in the cooler colors. You can see this darkest blue to intermediate blue, that's 400 meters, and then to this lighter blue is 120 meters. So what this is meant to show you is how much the southern coastal plain, where you guys are living, technically, because you're just over there, of Hermanus, it maybe went several tens of kilometers offshore, but if you look to the south areas off the Breeder River, the Goritz River, this is, over 150 kilometers of expansion of the coastal plain. So the argument is that during glacial periods, these maximum glacial periods, when generally Africa went drier and had less rain, and thus was less habitable by humans, that the south coast was in a very good position. Why? Because it had this expanded coastal plain of relatively temperate climate with abundance of water, abundance of wetlands. It was been extremely flat and not very well drained, with probably a lot of flays and lakes and so forth, not to mention rivers. And because of the expansion of the coastal plain, it was easily accessible for those coming along the west coast or the east coast to enter into it. What happens when sea level rises quite rapidly during the melting of the ice is, of course, this big piece of real estate, which was previously abundant with game and human populations, contracts appreciably to the present-day coastline. People are effectively isolated because now they are surrounded by ocean and the mountains. So we have the Cape Fold Belt, which stretches from Cape Honklip up into the Ceres Basin, across to George, and then across to Port Elizabeth. Although not impossible to negotiate, would have been very difficult. The mountains are rugged. The feignbaulous biome that grows there does not support plants that are particularly edible for humans outside of the bulbs of the geophytes. And so the coastal plain would have been still the desired area to live. It would have been wetter, and as you know, has year-round rainfall. So that it was less vulnerable to drought, and people could move around on that coastal plain to adapt to that area. So that's a way to present the southern coastal plain as one that could have been potentially isolated, and also one in which the population density would have changed potentially with each of these glacial and interglacial cycles. Because what you're doing is having a potential animal population supporting a human population that's initially the size of this lowered sea level curve out here, and then you're greatly contracting it. And what that does, of course, for the animals is they simply have to adjust their population size to match the density that can be supported based on the resources. But humans are different, right? Humans are different in the sense because they can culturally develop means by which to extract more food from an environment, perhaps through eating seafood, doing more cooperative hunting, developing more sophisticated hunting tools, and so forth. The idea is that this repeated expansion, contraction, enhanced or was a driving mechanism by which people were forced to think about how to change their culture in a way that would get them to a point where they could get more food out of the environment. And that's reflected primarily in the skull of Homo erectus. So the skeleton here on the far left, that's Homo erectus. There's Homo sapien, that's us next to him. And basically you can see the skeletons are more or less similar. The main difference is in the skull, and that's what I've blown up here. This is Homo erectus on the left of the skull, and then on the right is Homo sapiens. And of course, what's very distinctive about us, particularly evident in babies and in bald people, is how bulbous and rounded our skull is. And that, of course, is because we have a large brain. The brain endocast is shown below. This would be the cast made on the inside of the skull that housed the brain. And you can see that the Homo erectus brain is about a third the size of our current brain. So the idea is in the chart below that the directional selection for a bigger brain evolutionarily was driven by a variable climate, which periodically made life hard. So normally life was relatively easy, everything was going fine, and you'd periodically have these stress tests through climate change, and then living is hard. And it forces groups to think about and develop tools or behaviors that will allow them to extract more food. That, of course, allows them to grow a bigger brain, which allows them more cognitive abilities to effectively develop better tools and better behaviors towards getting more food. So it's this positive feedback loop towards the evolution of a larger brain. So that's, in a nutshell, one of the ideas of how that worked. I also mentioned that I think the inclusion of seafood was incredibly important. And the reason for that is because seafood is such an optimal food for growing a brain. It's a high-calorie source of omega fatty acids, protein, vitamin A and B12, iodine, zinc, iron, etc. And it was such a rich, readily available source of food, both as shellfish, beach seals, etc. And if we think about the populations of Cape fur seal colonies and whales that existed prior to their overhunting and decimation, and the fact that we still, while walking on the beach, will occasionally come across a beached whale or a seal, suggests that these would have been far more frequent in the past. So not just the rocky intertidal shores, but also the beaching of large mammals would have been an incredibly rich source of food. Plus, beaches are free of many of the dangers associated with freshwater habitats, crocodiles, lion, and hippo, which are supposedly the animal that kills the most people through trampling. So they were relatively safe. Now, to quote Jonathan Swift, he was a bold man that first ate an oyster, and I would argue, or a limpet. There's a limpet there on the right. It turns out they're easy to collect from the intertidal shores. You don't really even have to cook them at all. You can eat them raw. In fact, they're very easy to overcook and make them too tough to eat, to chew. And young kids, mothers, grandfathers could easily scavenge from coastal intertidal pools. And so it was a readily available source of resources. And for those who discovered it, would have been critical in the survival, particularly in times of drought and low food resources on land, because of course an intertidal pool doesn't care about a drought. It just carries on as before. Drought would not affect it. The other key aspect of the South Coast, I believe, that was important is the major limiting factor to coastal environments is a source of fresh water. The problem with most coasts is they're quite remote. They do not have good access to fresh water. And of course, fresh water is absolutely critical. What's nice about the South Coast, with its year-round rainfall, its low-lying coastal plain, you get these lovely coastal lakes. Sedgefield, shown here, is a good example. So you had this wonderful close proximity of freshwater sources to marine resources. And that was probably an ideal situation for humans who were trying to survive in a highly variable setting, and would have been an incredibly valuable resource, fallback resource for them in terms of their survival and the growing of a big brain. Now, the earliest evidence of when we first started to eat seafood is from Pinnacle Point caves. Pinnacle Point is just to the east of the Goritz River, mouth there on the south coast. There's a picture of the caves, and within those caves, they found evidence of mussels, so the brown mussel, Perna perna, and they found this small barnacle shell, maybe a centimeter across. But importantly, that barnacle is known to only grow on the southern right whale. So the argument is they probably scavenged and collected cut up meat of the southern right whales that were beached and then carried it back to their caves and ate it. And the only record that we have of that is the little barnacle shell that's left behind. So seafood was first really documented to occur on the South Coast at a very early time of 164,000 years ago, bearing in mind that our species evolved in Africa. It's debated, but roughly 200 plus or minus 50,000 years ago. So it roughly coincides with the timing of when our species evolved. Now, we may very well find older seafood evidence, but so far not. And so in that sense, it appears that Southern Africa was somewhat unique in its early adaptation of a seafood diet. So to help summarize that, this is again a rather busy diagram, but it's got a time scale at the bottom from 200,000 years ago on the left to 60,000 years ago on the right, and the areas in Africa in which cultural items have been found. So in North Africa and the Levant, there's evidence of burial goods, shell jewelry, and specific tools. In East Africa, you have perhaps death ritual items, a lot of ochre. But it's in Southern Africa that you get, first off, the earliest evidence of consumption of seafood, the use of heat in altering stone tool raw materials, in this case silkcrete, to make it more workable. So we call that pyrotechnology. They had a lot of ochre, and in fact have recovered ochre toolkits from Blombos Cave, in which there are charcoal, there's bone material, probably for marrow, there's the abalone shale as a container, etc. They also have evidence of what are called keepsake shells, which are shells that were pretty. This one doesn't look particularly pretty because it's a fossil or a subfossil and it's lost its color. But these would have been collected simply because they were thought to be pretty and brought back, not to eat. Engraved ochre, the famous piece from Blombos, there's engraving, earliest evidence of abstract thought, along with engraved ostrich eggshells, shown here, and bone points, still bay points, beautifully crafted fine point tools, microlithic stone tools that were used in a number of different composite tools, such as bow and arrow. So the argument would be that if our species arrived, anatomically modern humans arrived somewhere around 200,000, by 60, 70,000 years ago, we had become culturally more or less equivalent to the modern day hunter-gatherers, like the San, the Bushmen. And that primarily, not exclusively, but it primarily took place in Southern Africa. It also took place a lot in Northern Africa, because my hunch is that these two areas were, North Africa and South Africa, were the two extremes of Africa that were perhaps the most isolated, effectively isolated during those glacial, interglacial cycles. Then what happened, or one proposal, if equivalent of modern late Stone Age cultures emerged in Southern Africa first, by say around 60, 70,000 years ago, those groups would have then been very well equipped and capable of expanding into other parts of Africa, at least up into the Sahara barrier, which was a very quite strong barrier. But when that relaxed in terms of greening of the Sahara, which happens periodically, they could have then gone into North Africa, and it inadvertently would have crossed over the Sinai Peninsula, and once into Eurasia could have spread. They spread east, very rapidly arriving in Australasia by at least 46,000 years ago. There was a bit more resistance to their entry into Eurasia because it was well populated by Neanderthals. But eventually, between 46 and 40,000 years ago, Eurasia was occupied, and then, of course, up into Siberia. And because sea level was lower, Beringia, which was the land bridge connecting Siberia to North America, was land, and people could go across it. It was not covered in ice because it was too dry. So the ice sheets were further to the west, over here in the western part of Eurasia. This part was dry enough that people could cross over. And once the ice started to retreat, people could move quickly throughout the North and South America. This is the so-called Great Expansion, in which culturally modern humans, the equivalent of hunter-gatherers, that small groups of those still exist in the world, if tenuously. It is the idea that this was the global populating of the world. And it took longer for them to get to all the islands. Certainly in the near islands, the Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, and so forth were populated. And then there was a group out of Taiwan that went to the outer islands, the distal islands of New Zealand, Hawaii, etc. And in that way, humans filled the world. And in the process, they intermingled with some of the existing humans, the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, but they essentially also drove them all to extinction. So that only modern humans that came out of Africa were then populating the world, and of course have ever since. And interestingly, the world prior to farming, okay, so farming kicked in about 10,000 years ago, but prior to farming, the global population, the population that could essentially sustain us, was a population of roughly 5 million, which is more or less the greater Cape Town city area population. So it's just worthwhile bearing that in mind. That was the state of the world. And then, of course, farming evolved, but that's a whole nother story. And that led us, of course, to the much larger populations that we know today. I'll stop there. I'll just mention, for those of you who are interested, that if you want the full blown out detailed discussion of what I've been talking about, you can look to my book, Human Origins, How Diet, Climate, and Landscape Shaped Us. And I've also, as Gerrit mentioned, published some other books. The one was on the rocks and mountains of Cape Town. And most recently, I've published a book on the West Coast, a natural history of the West Coast, which summarizes much of what I've come to learn about the West Coast with my students. What I'll do is I'll stop here, happily take questions. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. Fascinating. I hope you heard the applause.
Yeah. Thank you.
So anybody with a question?
Thank you, John. You said towards the beginning of the talk that all of us have some Neanderthal genes. I was under the impression Neanderthals didn't come down into Africa, so surely you're talking about those of us whose origins come from the north.
Well, it's interesting. Initially, they thought that it was only people of European descent in Africa who had the Neanderthal DNA. But they did a more careful analysis of African DNA, and although they tend to have less, it's still there, which in a way makes sense because, of course, that Sinai Bridge and so forth was never closed, right? Completely closed. So they always had some exchange between Eurasia and Africa. And it turns out you just have to have a very minor number who are, intermingling, shall we say, the polite word, to spread that DNA. So you're right. You and I, being descendants from Northern Hemisphere, have maybe, I don't know, between 2 and 3% Neanderthal DNA. But Africans, Black Africans throughout Africa also have some Neanderthal DNA, just not as much. And interestingly, this is an interesting point, and that is, although we have just a couple of percent each, if you take all of the DNA in all of us, it's about 30% of the total Neanderthal DNA. So about a third of Neanderthals' genome lives on through us. And so some people argue, well, they're not really extinct, but I would argue against that because obviously they are extinct. So certain diseases like Crohn's disease, various things are thought to originate from Neanderthals and things like that. The whole genomic research that's being done on that. So I hope that helps answer your question. Yeah.
Helps me a great deal. Thank you.
Right.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question on that. What led to the demise of the Neanderthals? Was it because of the various climatic changes, or was it humans that moved up, particularly Eurasia, to wipe them out?
Yeah, that's a very debated topic. My personal feeling is that it was primarily us. And the reason for that is Neanderthals had already endured many major climatic cycles in the past before we rocked up. So it seems unreasonable. It's a little bit like the argument about the megafauna extinction. This would be the extinction of many of the large animals that were living in the Americas, for example. And people have also had this debate, was it humans who did them in, or was it the climate? I mean, climate may have put them under stress, definitely, and it may have contributed to their demise. But ultimately, they had already survived quite a number of major climate cycles. It seems unlikely that this one that just so happened to take place when humans were there was the one that would do them in. So I am of the opinion that we were the critical element that both led to the extinction of the Neanderthals and, rather sadly, to many of these large animals that were living in Australasia, North and South America, and also Europe, were done in by us, basically.
Thank you for the talk. Wondered about this expansion that you're talking about and what were the numbers like, proportion of the people, because it seems that the Southwestern Cape and all those areas were good places to settle. And I'm surprised that there's this continual movement out of Africa. Was it in very gradual? Was it in large numbers or just here and there, the intrepid ones seeking new places? I couldn't quite understand it.
Well, that's a good question. And I think what I would say is that humans multiply, right? That's what we do. That's what all species do. And I guess a species' success is based on how well they multiply and how well their own children multiply. I think the basic answer to that question is that if resources are good and conditions are good, we multiply, just like any species. And if we have the ability to move across the landscape and adapt to different environments, then that's what we'll do. I mean, remember in that great expansion, it was probably just a couple thousand years for humans, modern humans, to spread out of Africa all the way to Australia. And then once they crossed into North America, just a couple thousand years, and there were groups of them living at the southern tip of Chile. So it kind of boggles our mind to think that in a couple of millennia, humans could spread that quickly. But again, if you feed us and conditions are good, we go forth and we multiply. And I mean, they were adapted to environments in Siberia. We know people were living up there in around 40-odd thousand years ago. They had adapted to conditions in the high altitude of Tibet and the Andes. So humans are, of course, famous among all the other animals, although I don't know if they're aware or conscious of this or not, but the fact that we have such a propensity to adapt and to environments, to situations. So we will generally just fill the space that's available, which is what we did. Until, of course, all those spaces are full, which means that if you add any more people, they're not going to be able to be sustained. And that was my point about the end of the Great Expansion. Once the world was filled with people, it ended up with a population of about 5 million, which, gives you an indication of the carrying capacity, the natural carrying capacity of many landscapes. It's very small. And I guess that makes sense if you think about how much food you put in your shopping trolley every week when you go to Pick and Pay or Woolies, wherever you shop, and you think of how calorically rich that food is, and you think to yourself, okay, if there were no Woolies or Pick and Pays, how would I actually go about filling my trolley with all the calories I need and for me, my family to survive? It's huge. So ultimately, we will fill any available space and adapt very cleverly to it. I mean, look at the people living in Greenland and living off walrus meat and so forth, and living in very harsh conditions. But we'll fill all those spaces, but we'll never be able to fill them beyond our capacity. That was at least until the invention of agriculture. But as I said, that's a whole nother lecture.
John, can I just ask you again, do I understand from your slides that Homo sapiens developed exclusively in southern Africa, in the area in the south coast, as you explained, and none of these other pockets that you showed in Africa, for instance, the Olduvai Gorge, they all came from southern Africa? Is that correct?
No, that's not correct, and I didn't mean to imply that. What I meant was Homo sapiens were throughout Africa. They were living in the Maghreb in North Africa, throughout East Africa, and in Southern Africa. What I meant was that among those Homo sapiens, there were groups that had accelerated cultural evolution in terms of tools and abstract thought and, other types of cultural artifacts and behaviors. And for example, in Southern Africa, I think we were the only ones eating seafood, which you might think, well, that's a relatively minor thing. You have friends who don't like seafood and you do, whatever, it's not a big deal, doesn't make a big difference. But in this case, I'm arguing it made a huge difference because that one cultural behavioral difference was huge in terms of their biology and their survivability. So what I'm arguing is there were Homo sapiens throughout Africa. We know that. That's well established. But they were not all behaving the same, and they did not have the same cultural lives. So what I'm arguing is that what we think of as modern hunter-gatherers, those groups that have survived, like the San in Southern Africa, that level of cultural evolution first happened in South Africa. And that was critical because it gave them the versatility and the adaptability to really go forth and multiply successfully. And it would have been against other Homo sapiens. It would have been against the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, you name it. Does that make sense?
Okay, got it. Thank you very much. John, thank you very much. And thank you for the very clear way which you explained it all, and for your patience and the way you presented. It was fascinating. Thank
It's
you.
my
those
pleasure.
girls as well.
My pleasure. Have a great day.